Hello, everybody. This is Jane DeMarines with Climate and Cuisine, a podcast of Climate Diet. And I am the executive director of Climate Diet. And our guest today, we are thrilled to have Dr. Garrett Broad. He is an associate professor um, in the Department of Communication Studies at Rowan University, a mid-sized school in Glassboro, New Jersey, in the Philadelphia suburbs. And he also serves as Provost's Fellow for Sustainability. So I have a little more to say about your background, but Garrett, welcome. Professor Broad, welcome.
Thank
And
you so
thanks for
much.
joining us.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
Let me just mention a few things for our audience. So Dr. Professor Broad's background includes research, and I would like to hear more about that. And he's teaching to explore connections between contemporary social movements, food systems, and digital media technology, something we're all thinking about all the time, or at least I am. He's the author of More Than Just Food, Food Justice and Community Change, as well as a variety of articles on food's relationship to environmental sustainability, economic equity, and the health of humans and non-human animals. An engaged professor, an engaged scholar, Professor Broad writes for both academic and public audiences and works to develop collaborative research projects with a range of social change focused organizations. In addition to that, though, he serves as the president of the board for the Plant-Based Foods Institute, and I think that's where I met him several years ago. It's a nonprofit organization that works to identify and implement effective business and policy practices in support of sustainable plant-based food systems. In the classroom, his teaching experience includes courses on environmental communication, persuasion, strategic communication, food systems, and social change. So what a big piece of work you're involved in and so many different facets to it. So it's so exciting to have you here, especially since I have a communications background, and really so much of the success of any endeavor involves how we communicate what we're doing. Am I right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fundamental. And I think, a lot of folks think, well, everybody communicates, right? Communication, what do you need to kind of study that for? But I think anybody who's involved in trying to influence individual behavior or policy change knows that there really is an art and a science to it. And so what I try to do is understand those different dynamics, and do research that helps us better understand the context, and then hopefully also offer some practical insights that can be used by folks who are doing the work on the ground to promote a more healthy, sustainable food system, and particularly our shared interest in climate oriented and plant-based diets as well.
Well, since you brought that up, and this isn't among the questions, but I would love to hear about any research that you might want to just briefly tell us about that you've done that does help to set the stage for the best way to talk about the food and the climate.
Yeah.
Plant-based eaters are maybe 1% of the population, vegan and no meat, no dairy, no eggs. It's a tiny percent of the population. So
Yeah.
other parts of this big population, the other 99%, aren't always open to this message, I found.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a hard challenge we've picked here, right? To try to shift diets in ways that go against a lot of major social norms, against major institutional structures. And so I think that's always an important place to start, right? We're not expecting to turn the world vegan overnight. But there are things that we can do to better understand what are folks open to, what might really turn them off. Some example research projects that I've done relatively recently. I did a bunch of focus groups with consumers in the US and the UK, talking to them about a whole host of perceptions related to meat, conventional meat, grass-fed local meat, but also plant-based, more whole food plant-based diets, as well as meat alternatives, plant-based meats like your Beyonds and Impossibles, and even cultured meat, the kind of new technology in that area. I think there's a couple big insights that come out of that. One is that taste still really matters a lot. And so obviously, whatever we can do to get folks to taste good food is going to make a big difference in terms of whether they're open. And so, if we're trying to persuade some folks to make a shift from what their status quo is, we need to do it in a way that is going to be enjoyable for them, right? And so we can't forget about the pleasure piece of food and really try to encourage that on the plant-based food side.
Well, you're telling me I've done something right because I pass out vegan chocolate energy bars and everybody loves them.
Yeah, and it can, and it surprises people because I think when a lot of times when folks hear vegan, so much of what they initially hear is they're missing something, right? It's a lack of, right? I'm cutting something out. But I think one of the ways to frame, plant-based eating is it actually can open up a lot of great possibilities, and different types of flavors, or the types of flavors you've loved, but in a different way. And so that's something that certainly comes through a lot. I do think though it's not just taste though. So I'm somewhat skeptical of some of the arguments that have been out for a number of years that just say, hey, if we can match on taste and price and convenience, then automatically everybody's going to go plant-based, because there's a lot of deeply held cultural assumptions and values and norms that relate to class, that relate to gender, that relate to, family, that relate to all sorts of other things that are just really difficult to grapple with. And so I think one of the things that comes through a lot in my focus groups and my surveys, is just how deeply entrenched a lot of these practices are. And so we need to recognize that. We need to not assume that folks are just going to switch easily, and really figure out what are the kind of multiple ways that we can encourage change here, right? And so, that might be one of the things I hear a lot from folks is, if somebody was making my dinner every day, I would be open to eating more vegan food, right? And so how do we make that easier? How do we change, food service operations? How do we change these kind of structural dynamics that make it simpler and easier for folks to have access and enjoy plant-based foods? Some of that, though, is also, the folks who are more willing as well to try plant-based eating are folks who have been convinced in some ways by a ethical argument, whether that's an ethical argument about the environment, an ethical argument about animal well-being, or an argument about their health and well-being. And so I think sometimes we try to find this silver bullet. It's like, oh, we need to just have the best replacements. Oh, we need to have, vegan options by default. Oh, we need to have these really convincing arguments and these messages. And the answer is yes. We need all those things. And it's because we are the 1, 2, 3%, as you say. I say this as someone who's been, vegan for a long time now. And so recognize there's a lot of obstacles, there's a lot of barriers. And so we really need to be approaching this issue from a variety of different angles. Some of that is about communication and messaging and having the right messages and messengers in the right place, times and places. But some of it is also about reshaping our choice architecture, is the term that gets used in behavioral economics, to kind of make the decision, and communicating to, not necessarily just to individuals, but to food service providers or to institutions and organizations to create opportunities for engagement with the kind of plant-based food that we're trying to promote.
So, Professor Broad, could we go back to the focus groups? Was there any consensus you could take from that research that, just in terms of the messaging, was the key thing, the key takeaway from the overall focus groups? Or if there wasn't, just
I mean, I don't think there was any one thing, but there's a couple things that were particularly salient. I think we definitely are, there's a very strong connection between meat and this idea of meat as natural, and meat alternatives in particular, but plant-based eating even in general as unnatural. And so I do think that there are opportunities for us to explore that with consumers. One, by making more salient just how dramatically novel conventional meat production is, right? Like, this is not old McDonald on the farm. This is, high tech, intensive animal food production. And so, that I think to make that salient for folks at times can be helpful, just to say, hey, like this is not maybe the sort of bucolic landscape you're thinking of, right?
Right. And
And
it's
then
also the processed part of it
exactly,
that,
yeah, yeah,
the big message out is that plant-based burgers are so processed. Well, meat is also processed, and there's some of the
absolutely.
things they do to meat. I've read in supermarkets is they put, I believe, when the meat starts turning brown. This is ground beef in particular. When it starts turning brown after a few days, they put dye on it, and I think they may also put some form of alcohol or some
there's
substance.
there's
Just
all
which is
sorts of additives and colorants and things that get used, and this is actually an area where I have been doing a bunch of work as well, as kind of looking at these debates about food processing and ultra processed foods. And I find that framework that has gotten popular in recent years, there are some good ideas embedded in there, but I think the way that it has been deployed, I'm not a big fan of. And I think that the treatment of meat versus plant-based alternatives has been really unfair. And so this was actually another takeaway of those focus groups, that this discussion about, plant-based meats as ultra processed and therefore unhealthy has really picked up among a big segment of the population. So I think that is something that we need to engage with, to have a conversation that, ultra processed, if we're going to use that term, does not necessarily mean unhealthy. And the meats that are quote unquote minimally processed, are we sure they're actually minimally processed for the reasons that you just mentioned? And B, just because something's minimally processed doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy, right? And so I think trying to break that down,
absolutely,
it can be a challenge sometimes, because
absolutely.
I don't want to come across like I'm a shill for the big food companies, because I'm definitely not that. But the science is really just not there to say that all ultra processed foods that that fit into this category are unhealthy. In fact, what we know is that plant-based meats, particularly other non-dairy alternatives, I'm thinking like an unsweetened soy milk, for instance, like those are really good healthy foods for a lot of people. Are they perfect? No, but no food is. And yeah, back to the kind of way meat is produced. I use this example of there was an article a while back, I think in I want to say it was in Vox. It might have been Kenny Torella or another colleague there, who wrote about this practice called that they refer to as I think it's called feedback, which is in pork production, where they basically take baby piglets. Excuse me for the sort of graphic description here, but I think sometimes it's important to have these graphic conversations. They take baby piglets, they put them in basically giant blenders, they blend them
Mhm.
up, and they feed them back to the mother pigs, as part of a kind of fattening up process, and they call that feedback. Now, that pig, if you ate that ham later on, that would be a minimally processed food. To me, that doesn't sound so minimally processed, and it doesn't sound so appetizing, right? I'd rather a plant-based burger that has some pea protein, even if it has, methyl cellulose in there too. And so this is something that I think there is an opportunity for us to just to have evidence-based conversations about the nature of
Yeah,
food processing, about the strengths
yes.
of food processing, what does it bring, but also about the limits and about some of the, the elements of concern that exist. I don't think we should be, overstating ever. I'm really just a big advocate for honest, evidence-based advocacy, because there's a lot of folks who really want to undermine the cause of plant-based eating. And if you say something that is not, really good, solid, evidence-based information, there's going to be a million people ready to tear you down. And so I think we benefit when we have evidence-based
Yeah.
conversations, talk to people, with respect, talk to people with an understanding that, just because they have this information, they might not go all the way vegan, tomorrow, but let's have good, honest, evidence-based conversations. And I think
And
people
let's
respect
read
that.
and let's get people to read some of the research that talks about this. I mean, my husband and I became vegetarian and vegan when we read the China study, which our
Mm,
daughter gave us, who was vegan.
yeah.
And once we read it, we immediately just became 95% vegetarian.
And
But
that happens for some folks, Jane, but for a lot of folks it doesn't, right? And I
right.
think that's why we need this kind of multi-pronged approach, which is to say, all right, for some people, this information is going to come like for me, I was an undergraduate and I read about the environmental impacts of meat production for the first time. I had a professor. I was actually studying abroad at Leiden University in the Netherlands for a semester. And I took a course in sustainability and political theory. And I had a Dutch professor who was a vegetarian and had us read about the environmental impacts of animal food production. And I had never known about this, had never thought about this. And it really changed my life, changed how I ate. I became vegetarian and then vegan shortly thereafter. And now my career focuses on a lot of these issues. But we're weird, Jane. We're not the normal ones there. Most folks
Well,
are not just,
the
yeah,
Netherlands, I think they are first with the most, I think, vegans
yes,
in Europe because I print often in my newsletter, or not often, some of the time in my
yeah,
newsletter, percentages of the population that are vegan, and I know the UK and Europe is way ahead of the United States, and probably because they have less land. You know, they're small countries over there. They can't have the
yeah,
kind of cattle the billions of cattle. They don't
yeah.
have the
There,
space.
there,
But
there are
Netherlands
cultural
is big.
differences, and yeah, yeah,
They,
and
I think, had a goal of by 2035 having 50% of this is Amsterdam only
yeah, okay, yeah.
vegan, plant
Yeah.
based,
Yeah,
something
and you
like
go
that.
there, and I think it's a great example. I was there not too long ago for some work, and one of the things you notice is that there's a lot of plant-based options around you, right? You
Yes,
go to the grocery store and you go to the, the ready-made meal aisle. And if I go to a grocery store, even at our kind of fancy grocery stores, it's often hard to find a plant-based option in that ready-to-go meal aisle, but they've
yes,
got them there, right? And so that's just an example. Some of this is about messaging, but it's also about shaping our environments. It's also
right.
about,
Availability.
it's also, and that, what does that mean? Well, that means communicating and trying to persuade the folks who run that grocery store to have that in the to go aisle, right? And so
Right.
some of this is about reaching individuals, but it's also about reaching folks who can influence the options of others, whether it's at an organization or a grocery retail or a restaurant, so that they can, give that availability to others. So it's about this multi-pronged approach. People need multiple touch points, for the most part. Most folks are not immediately convinced to go vegan by reading a book. Some of us are, but most of us are not. And so they need those multiple nudges and touch points to go along with that information.
Well, so just following up, did health issues did health issues concern you more than climate issues when you became vegan, being exposed to it
Yeah.
in Europe, in the Netherlands? But was there one more important to you than the other, the climate or your own
Yeah.
health?
So for me, initially, it was an environment and climate consideration. But I would say, like many people, and this is also, something I've looked at in terms of the kind of psychology of vegetarianism and the demographics of vegetarianism, folks who stick with it tend to sort of layer reasons on top over time. And so that was definitely the case for me. So I would say initially that environmental concern, but shortly thereafter, I started to really think more deeply about the animal ethics of it all, and animal treatment and animal suffering. So that became a real driving force for me. And then the health piece of it was, I was young. I was not necessarily like as deeply health conscious at the time, but for me, it
Yeah.
was sort of like a nice bonus. I will say for me, especially kind of cutting down my dairy consumption. I was lactose intolerant. I guess I still am, but I wouldn't, I don't know because I don't eat dairy anymore. But that was one of those things that my whole life I was lactose intolerant, but I just ate dairy anyway, because everybody likes cheese because it's in everything, right? Because you don't think much of it. And
Right.
so where I found an impact on my personal health was probably even more cutting out dairy than anything else. But over time, I've been able to lead a healthy lifestyle as a vegan. I do also try to, communicate, and I think this is important for the plant-based movement to be careful about overclaiming the health impacts of a plant-based diet, right? I like to always say, like, I'm not in someone else's body. I can't tell someone else how they feel, right? And so I do think sometimes there's a tendency in some circles to say, oh, you said you were vegan and you weren't feeling good, and you must have been doing it wrong or you're lying. And like, you're just never going to hear me say that because I don't think that's going to bring somebody along, right? But I think there is, it is important to say, hey, there are healthy ways to be vegan and there are less healthy ways to be vegan. And also it might not be a priority for you. You can be a junk food vegan if that's what if that's what you want to be. But if you're really interested in sort of the health aspects of it, then these are the kind of dietary approaches and considerations you should bring to the table. But for me, it sort of started with environment, followed with the animal ethics, and then the health piece was also, as I've gotten older now, I think a little bit more about the health aspects than I did when I was, 20 and first started going.
Well, I've interviewed Dr. Neil Bernard from Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And one of the things that he said to me that I will never forget is that students that he's known, or just teens, as young as 15, already have clogged arteries from the saturated fat from meat.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
when I think of, the kids on the football team, because I think when he mentioned this, he mentioned boys in particular, not that girls aren't also on football teams, but it could be very dangerous to be playing sports like football and have clogged arteries, although they may not be completely clogged at the age of 15, but
Yeah.
that they're already showing signs of what is going to be a future problem for them.
Yeah, I think one of the things too is that, and this is a message that I try to, emphasize is, you know, it's not going to be a bad idea to eat more plants, right? Like that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go vegan or even vegetarian right away,
Right.
right? But we are such in the U.S., especially where where I'm from and I live and where most of my work focuses. We're such a meat heavy diet culture, and I think
Yeah.
almost everybody would benefit from building more plant-based foods into their diet. And I think there is a lot of attention on protein in our culture. Sometimes maybe even too much attention on protein. But I think it's interesting. There's been a big push in recent years that, we've started to see a rise in colon cancer, for instance, in young people. And there might be something about fiber that is going on. We tend to have really low fiber intakes as Americans, young Americans in particular. And so, great source of fiber to eat your beans, your legumes, your vegetables, your fruits. And so that's something that I think can be a really winning message, which is, look, again, it's not just about taking things out, but adding things in. And can we add some more of these healthy plant-based foods into your diet as a way to, to set you up for long-term health. And yeah, that's what I would be probably recommending some of those young football players.
So along the same lines of messaging, we have Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers, and I think, well, I shouldn't say that most vegans. I would say a lot of the vegans that I know, rely on these because they're so tasty and they're so quick to prepare, and they're healthy. But if you had students that you wanted to tell them to message plant-based eating to their friends, would you would you recommend they sort of push, not push, but teenagers tend to like burgers, right?
Yeah,
Push those, or are those names, from, this is a couple questions combined into
sure.
one here, but those names, Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat, are those good messaging, advertising names, do you think?
Yeah. So, there's a couple pieces embedded in that. Let me start with the kind of, the first question in terms of, how could students talk to their peers about plant-based eating? And again, I would go back to like, don't talk, eat, like
Oh, right.
make something good. Like that's the best place to start. This is, I'll give a personal example, which is, my wife and I do all the cooking for our family Thanksgiving, right? And so we don't even make a big deal about the fact that all the food is vegan, right? And there is, and this is controversial within the vegan community, but there is still some turkey there. We don't touch the turkey, but some other family members insist it's a big Thanksgiving family party. But everything else is vegan. We make everything else, and we don't even mention it, right? And everybody goes, "Oh man, these mashed potatoes are great." Oh, these, and then at the end of the event, we might remind folks, "Hey, everything other than that dry turkey that nobody liked was really was vegan, right? And that's, you know, a good starting place, right? Is to just give them something good to eat. And so for my students who are interested in advocating for plant-based foods, I really encourage them to start there. Provide a good meal for friends, you know, that tastes good, that's plant-based. And that can be, I think, for a lot of folks, a great entry point is to start with those Impossible and Beyond burgers or the sausages or whatever it might be, because that's a familiar food, a familiar taste. It's easy, it's simple, and you can, you know, have a conversation there. But I
I have
also
to
think,
jump in here though
please,
about the taste and what you
yeah,
just said. For since you brought up Thanksgiving, so my daughter, my third daughter, who is not vegan, is coming for Thanksgiving this year, and I said, "Well, we'll buy a turkey and have that for you guys." And she goes, "Oh no, no! The last time we came and had a dinner with you, you had this mushroom type turkey dish," and she said it was absolutely delicious. She says, "Don't bother with any turkey for us. We loved that." So
that's
I was so
great.
surprised.
Yeah,
No, I didn't remember that being the experience,
yeah.
but I was surprised. So
I have,
obviously the taste right
yeah.
on in line with what you've been saying.
Yeah,
The taste
I
matters.
haven't quite gotten there with my stepfather yet, but we'll see what we can do over time. But that's great, and I think that shows the power of just a good meal.
Right.
And then the conversation can start from there, you know. And you know, this is you know, my research focuses a lot on plant-based foods. Another area of research that I focused a lot is on healthy food access more generally. And the book that I wrote, you mentioned at the start, was called More Than Just Food. And that was a term that I heard so much from the organizers that I was studying and collaborating with, who were trying to promote kind of healthy eating and healthy lifestyles in low income communities. And they would say, you know, the work that we're doing is about more than just food. We use food as an entry point. We use food as a conversation starter. That brings people in the door, right? And I think so often, you know, as vegan advocates, especially those of us who come from maybe an animal rights perspective or from an environmental activist perspective, we want to really start with the, you know, the earth is burning or these animals are suffering. And I get that passion and I share that. But I find that conversation works much better once folks have had a good meal. And then they go, oh, this is interesting. Oh, tell me a little bit more. How'd you get here? Why that, you know, and then rather than, because when you start with just the info and the doom and gloom, people get really defensive. You know, this is another thing that came out in those focus groups that, you know, I remember a guy in one of the focus groups said, you know, every time I hear, you know, kind of a vegan talk about this stuff, it just makes me want to eat more meat. Right. And I think that we get a lot of what's, you know, called psychological reactance here. We get people who feel just by the virtue, you know, by the nature of having this issue raised, feel like they're attacking you. Right. Well, if you just gave somebody a meal, it doesn't seem like you're attacking them. Right. And so that's how I really encourage folks to start with some good food. It could be Beyond, Impossible, etc. But also I think, as I said, there's a lot of opportunities to expand people's palate. You know, before I went vegetarian and vegan, I didn't eat Ethiopian food. I didn't eat my Indian food. Like you know, being vegetarian and vegan has opened up my palate, has opened up, you know, my culinary worldview to a whole lot of cuisines that have a long history of plant-based food in them. You know, many of them have gotten more meat heavy recently, you know, as meat has become, you know, there's a lot of kind of like holiday cultural meals have become what we associate with eating, you know, everyday meals in a lot of places. But, you know, you go to a lot of cultural communities around the world and a lot of the default eating is mostly plant-based, maybe with a little bit of, you know, meat put into a stew. And so that would be another thing that I think to really help people see, hey, this can actually open up possibilities for eating. It's not just about a lack. It's not just about taking away your meat. It's about opening up different kinds of foods that we can eat. So that was an answer to a piece of your question. Let me pause for a second because there was also the other question about kind of Beyond and Impossible. But wondering if you any pieces of that you wanted me to follow up on.
You know, I'd like to switch gears and go back to the environment again.
Hmm.
Um, there was some research, and I think it might have been out of a university. I'm trying to think of near you, but I'm forgetting. Anyway, it was showed essentially that the highest level of anxiety among young people, and I think it was 20 to 30-year-olds or something in that range, is anxiety about climate change. And so that is a different starting point than what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But obviously they're linked because taste the food, you like the food, and then you find out, oh, it's good for the climate. I mean, again, that was sort of how it happened with us. When we heard it was good for the climate, it was enough for us. But do you see that, since you have students, maybe not quite in that age range, but at least part of that age range, talking at all about the climate and the diet connection, or just in general, do you see affirmation of climate
Yeah.
anxiety among your students?
Jane, guess what topic I was just teaching about before I came back to my office when I was teaching my environmental communication class today? Today was our climate and eco anxiety day.
My
So
gosh.
yeah, so it literally just got out of class talking about that. Yeah, and it was interesting. I actually gave them a little survey to fill out that would sort of measure their level of climate anxiety, and it really ranged in this class from some folks who scored quite high to some who scored very low, and a lot of folks in the middle. I think there is a lot of doomerism that exists in social media. A lot of these kids have been getting, these young people have been getting a lot of these messages about, planet Earth is, at the edge of extinction for a long time. And I think that those kinds of messages, maybe well-intentioned at times, can be really disempowering.
Yeah.
And I think we really need to find that balance between, all right, we don't want to be, climate denialists who say, oh, this is no big deal. Don't worry about it. It's fake. It's not something that's going to affect us, right? That's not good. That's not true. And it's not good. But we also don't want to just be consistently sending a message to young people, especially that says, oh, you're doomed. Why even bother? Don't, you've got no future. You're never going to have kids with a future. In fact, if you have kids, you're evil for bringing them into this world, right? Like, that is deeply disempowering. And so, what we talked about in class today was there's an author. She's a marine biologist and an author, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who she's got a TED Talk and a book, and she shows this little Venn diagram that I have my students fill out. And the Venn diagram included questions about what skills do you have, right? That can be in any area. What brings you joy? Like what excites you? And what are, issues that matter that we need change on when it comes to the climate? And so that Venn diagram, that, what is in that middle of those three things, your skills, your joy, and the issues that matter to you that can make a difference, that thing in the middle is your climate action. And that can be large scale stuff, that can be changing, that can be your career mission, or it can be, hey, I'm going to focus on, plant-based diets in my home and with my family, or, getting people to compost, or whatever it might be. So it can go from large scale to small scale. But that's kind of how I try to approach it. One, which is there is still hope, right? The problems are real. They're serious. They're local and global, but there are some positive things that are happening at a large scale, and also things you can always do as an individual, right? Individual action is not going to solve all our problems, but I think sometimes we can also, denigrate individual action. It starts with individual action. I went vegetarian, I went vegan. That was an individual action, and that has been something that I brought with me to this work that I do as a researcher, as an advocate, as a teacher. And so, those things are not mutually exclusive. I feel like sometimes we can say, oh, the individual action, it's a waste of time. Well, no, it's not, because we live our lives as individuals, but we're also in community and in networks and it's part of society. So, yeah, that's something this topic I think really resonates, and hopefully that Venn diagram is something that resonated with my students and hopefully can give them some ideas of actions they can take. I mean, I will also say I really try to build in action-oriented elements into all the classes that I teach.
I think that's
It's
great.
not just about reading. Reading matters, right? It's not just about reading and writing. That stuff matters, but also, as part of my courses, we, include community engaged learning elements where they have to go out and do some volunteering at the local food pantry, or
Fantastic.
develop a media project because we're in communication that advocates on campus for some environmental or food system issue that matters and that makes a difference. So getting them, really motivating them to take action is a really important and powerful element of this work.
That is so great, the action part of it, because I agree with you. Just talking about it isn't enough. And that brings me to kind of the last question that I know you have other deadlines to meet. So the last question really is, do you see, and it's kind of a short one, I think, do you see a growth in plant-based eaters among your students over the years? Since I think you've been teaching quite a while, a couple decades, am I right?
Yeah, I think I officially started. So I started graduate school in 2008. And so I started as like a teaching assistant in say 2010. So yeah, solid 15 years since I've had students, kind of my own courses starting maybe a dozen years or so ago. I think a lot has changed. And I think, mostly for the better. It's not so strange and foreign to folks as it was. And I do think the Beyonds, the Impossibles, have been a big part of that. Now, some of that has come with some downsides, I think, in terms of there was a lot of hype connected to some of these companies, and some of that hype maybe we sort of overshot that hype in terms of I think of like the founder of Impossible Foods saying something like, by 2035 or something like that, that animal agriculture would be done. I forget the exact claims that were made, but I always felt like, hey, that's, let's be honest, let's be reasonable and practical here. But yeah, my students, I think when they hear vegan or plant-based, it's not like so strange as it was, right? When they hear about, when I talk to them about research that I've done on, people's perceptions of meat alternatives, or even stuff around cultured meat and cultivated meat, many of them have heard of this stuff. It's out there. They see it on their social feeds in ways that 15 years ago they definitely weren't aware. I think many of them are more likely to know somebody who's vegan or vegetarian, or at the very least has reduced their meat consumption. But I think a lot of the same challenges remain. You've got a lot of folks who, either the students, themselves, but oftentimes, whether it's an uncle, I often kind of just put it in the guise of the uncle, right? Like that uncle at Thanksgiving who's like, what are you doing? This is stupid. And, we're humans. We've got the canine teeth for a reason. And, and so I think a lot of them also still struggle with how do I be vegetarian or reduce my meat when I've got this pressure coming from my uncle or my mom, or to go back to the
Or maybe the
Thanksgiving.
meat industry
Right.
having
Yeah.
disinformation campaigns.
Yeah, and that's out there for sure. I think of, to go back to the Thanksgiving example, I've had students say, to me, or others say to me over the years, like, oh, I totally would be vegetarian, but, I just can't not, eat my grandma's Thanksgiving turkey, right? Or the ham she makes on Christmas. And I say, like, there really is no vegan police. Like, you can be vegetarian or vegan all year except eating that ham or that turkey if you want. Like, if
Right.
that's what you choose, if that's, if that's what makes sense for you, like, there really isn't, like, you're not going to go to vegan jail. And so, to me, to encourage somebody to be, vegan most of the time, but except in those cases where they feel like they can't, that to me is much better than somebody getting turned off entirely and being vegan none of the time. And so, there's been a long debate in the animal protection, animal rights community about the sort of purity politics of it all. I've tended to be someone who, doesn't shy away from saying that I'm vegan, and I have reasons for that. And I've been vegan for, pushing 20 years now. But also that this is my life, and I can encourage you and say that this is, something that's viable. But also, if going 100% isn't what's going to work for you, I'd love for you to go as far as you think is plausible for you, and make those small steps that maybe can become bigger steps, and also, influence the people around you and the institutions around you, because that can make a big difference. And if it's going to keep you engaged, rather than feeling like you want to shy away entirely from it because you can't go 100%, I'd rather have you stay engaged and continue to be an advocate,
I
without the
totally,
purity.
I totally agree with all that. And I guess I should just mention my organization, Climate Diet, promotes reduced meat consumption,
Yeah,
and we don't really directly promote veganism because I think there's a lot of people in my own generation that are resistant to it, that uncle or you're talking about. But if you talk to them about what giving up meat one day a week does for the climate, so
absolutely.
my daughter that was working on her PhD did the math for me, and we just took the population of the United States for 1 year. If they gave up meat one day a week, it's equal to taking 25 million gas-powered cars off the road. So it's
Yeah.
a huge impact on the climate if people just did it one day a week. And we have a meat down pledge, and I use it. So I sometimes teach in a program called Power of Food in Montgomery County, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. And we ask them to sign a pledge, and we give them energy bars for signing it. And there's no, as you mentioned, there's no police. We're not going to
Right.
check on them, but we say, just give it up one day a week. And they sign a little pledge and give us an email address if they want to get plant-based recipes from us every Friday. And, everybody signs it. And I don't know what happens, but they do learn that you don't have to do it 7 days a week. You can
Sure.
start and you can help the environment. And we give them the data. You can really help the environment by just taking one step. And, if they take that one step, maybe they see there's plenty of food out there. You don't have to eat meat. There's
Yeah.
plenty of food out there that's delicious.
And then maybe they go and they advocate at their company, hey, we should make sure we have a plant-based option when we're having an event, or and so I think that's you got to keep people engaged, keep people in the loop. Folks don't generally respond very well to to messages that they feel like are attacking who they are as people. And so that doesn't mean don't point out some of the problems, but it does mean always engage folks with compassion and empathy and understanding, and give them practical tools for what they might do to align their behavior with their values. And that's what it's all about. And if there's enough of us doing that kind of work and getting those folks engaged in that way, and they can engage others, then we can really have the kind of the network effect to continue to scale this up.
Well, and just along those same lines about giving people practical tools, I mentioned our recipes that we put out every Friday. Well, it turns out we put out various things. We have some newsletters and we have a podcast. The thing that gets the most attention uh, are the recipes.
Here we go again, right?
It really
We
surprised me. We just found this
eating
out.
because
Yeah.
people want to eat good food, right? That's what, and they want, and when they see, hey, I can still eat good food in a way that is a plant-based food, that I think really engages people, really keeps people in and it allows you to build the conversation from there. So yes, that I think is as big an insight from a communication perspective, like eating is communication, right? And sharing that meal is communication, and giving people those recipes is effective communication. And so I really encourage us to continue to lead with good food, and it'll make the rest of the arguments about climate and health and animals much easier if folks have a full belly.
Well, Professor Broad, this has just been a delightful conversation filled with
Thank
so
you.
much good
Likewise.
information. Thank you for the work that you do in this sector and helping to share the important information in communicating in plant-based when it fits into your own classwork. It sounds like it does. So thanks so much for being here. And
Thank you.
we'll give you information on and put your contact information on this if that's okay with you.
Perfect. Yeah, always love to hear from folks from all walks of life. I work at a public state university, and so I kind of consider it part of my job of engaging with the public and hearing from folks and answering questions and learning more from others. And so always love to hear folks. I'm easy to get a hold of.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today to hear Dr. Garrett Broad from Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey.